Stanislas Dehaene's dream in Consciousness and the Brain is to identify what he calls the signatures of consciousness and to map on a one-to-one scale our conscious experiences to the neural events that, on his view, cause them. Now, this means that Dehaene, by all accounts, is a reductionist, a label that he wears quite proudly in the book. Indeed, he argues that all neuroscientists are to some extent reductionist, meaning that they must believe that learning something about neural networks, neural pathways, neural circuits will teach us something of value about the way in which we experience the world more globally. At one point, he even says that all neuroscientists are committed to the view that humans are nothing more than brains in a vat, and that in theory, it is perfectly possible to imagine a situation in which we could recreate somebody's entire experience of the world in a laboratory simply by tampering with the specifics of their brain, by making a little tweak here and a little tweak over there. And he concludes chapter 4, which is arguably the most important chapter in the entire book, by arguing that the movie The Matrix is not science fiction. We will get there. It's just a matter of enhancing our technological capacities. Now, although this kind of reductionism is quite common among neuroscientists, it's important to clarify that it's not universal. There are many neuroscientists who argue that not every aspect of our conscious lives can indeed be traced back to a neural origin that we can isolate and manipulate and even use in a predictive manner in the laboratory. Still, Stanislas Dehaene is a famous proponent of this reductionist outlook. And in chapter 4 of his book, he lays out the core tenets of his reductionist interpretation of consciousness. In it, he tries to identify the main signatures of conscious experience, of which he says there are 4. The first signature of conscious experience on Dehaene's account is amplification. Anytime we are affected by the world, let's say that I hear a sound or that I see an image, that stimulus triggers in my brain a wave of neural activation. But according to Dehaene, the wave that is triggered by stimuli that are conscious and stimuli that remain unconscious are not the same. Thus, there is a difference at the very level of the brain wave between consciousness and unconsciousness. When we are presented a stimulus, but remain unaware of it, maybe because it was masked or because it was presented to us for only a very short period of time, such that it remains subliminal, this triggers a brainwave that, according to Dehaene, doesn't last a very long time. In fact, it's a wave that dissipates after a couple hundred milliseconds. By contrast, when we are presented with a stimulus that we become aware of, this triggers a neuronal event that lasts a longer period of time and that over time amplifies, meaning that it grows in intensity and it mounts. That's the first difference between conscious experience and unconscious experience. Unconscious experience dissipates, whereas conscious experience rises in intensity. The example that Dehaene uses over and over again in this book is that of vision. And he says, in all cases of vision, independently of whether it's conscious or unconscious, we see the same initial stages. Something enters the eye and it gets sent to the visual cortex for initial visual processing. What makes a difference between perception that is conscious and perception that is not conscious is whether or not it then amplifies from there and spreads into other areas of the brain for higher level processing. Thus, what is important for consciousness, according to him, is that the wave actually increases in intensity and amplifies. In chapter 4, he uses the metaphor of an avalanche to make sense of this mounting or ascending movement. He says, in the same way that a snowball, when dropped from the top of a mountain, can lead to an avalanche that increases in intensity, so too a visual stimulus can create an avalanche event in our brain as it passes through various parts of the brain, ultimately leading to that final event, which is the moment of conscious perception. The second signature of consciousness is what is known as the P3 wave. Now, the waves that we have when we are conscious of something and when we're not conscious of something, as I just explained, are not the same. One descends and dissipates after a few hundred milliseconds. whereas the other one actually goes in an upward trajectory. Dehaene points out that the temporality of these waves is also different. It's not just their directionality, that one goes down and one goes up. It's actually their temporal organization. When we're dealing with unconscious phenomena, what we get is a P1 wave. All that means is that there is a wave of neural activation that begins roughly at the beginning of the onset of the stimulus and that lasts between 100 and 200 milliseconds. That's why it's called P1. It's a positive wave, P, that lasts between 100 and roughly 200 milliseconds. By contrast, when we're dealing with a consciously perceived stimulus, what we get is a P3 wave. It's a different wave that lasts longer and that actually peaks at around 300 to 400 milliseconds after the onset of the stimulus. So roughly about a third of a second after we see this spike of neural activation. According to Dehaene, this means that there is a difference in the very structure of the temporality of the neural events associated with unconscious perception versus conscious perception. And he argues throughout chapter 4 that we see this P3 wave that is so important in a lot of research on conscious perception, where the very moment that people become aware of having been presented with a stimulus happens to be at around 300 to 400 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus itself. So that the P3 wave is indeed that marker of conscious awareness. It's the moment that we say, I saw a thing, I heard a thing, I sensed a thing. He also points out that the P3 wave shows up in error detection. So when I make a mistake, so for example, I'm walking around and I accidentally knock over a glass of water, if I become aware of my mistake, it usually happens at around that time marker as well. I hit the glass of water and in about a third of a second, I try to catch it, but I'm just too slow. By contrast, if I'm walking around and I knock the glass of water, but I do not become aware of having done that, we do not see the P3 event. This means that the P3 wave is something that accompanies, on Dehaene's account, all kinds of conscious experiences by virtue of the fact that they are conscious. It's that aha moment when something makes it through the bottleneck from the unconscious to the conscious level of experience. The third signature of conscious experience is high frequency. According to Dehaene, anytime we see that P3 wave, we know that we are in the presence of consciousness and that it plays a critical role in the generation of consciousness because it triggers what Dehaene calls a global ignition event. In other words, as soon as we see that P3 wave, that spike, about a third of a second after the presentation of a stimulus, it brings together the activity of very distant parts of the brain. So we're not dealing just with the activation of this region of the brain or this region of the brain in isolation. Now we're talking about many parts coming together and entering into communication with one another. When this happens, those areas of the brain start firing in the same frequency. The frequency can be very slow, or it can be very high. And we know that different frequencies, which are often referred to using letters of the Greek alphabet, so alpha, beta, delta, theta, we know that those different frequencies, fast, slow, medium, are associated with different kinds of experiences and even different states of consciousness. So for example, there's a difference in the frequency of activation when we're asleep, when we're dreaming, when we're awake, when we're doing a really difficult math problem. Those don't have the same frequency associated with them. Now, according to Dehaene, when we have a conscious experience, there is an increase in gamma band power, which is a high frequency band, meaning that various parts of the brain start firing at a relatively high speed in a way that suggests that they are communicating with one another and trying to synthesize information in order to create a global, coherent perception. The fourth signature of conscious experience is synchronization. Dehaene is very clear that it's not just that the brainwave that is activated by conscious perception increases like an avalanche rather than decreases. And it's not just that it happens at a particular moment in time, the 3 to 400 millisecond window. And it's not just that it has a high frequency effect on the brain. What's really important is that in conscious perception, we witness a high level of synchronization in the entire brain, meaning that consciousness leads to the activation of what he calls the brainwave. Entirely different parts of the brain interact with one another and synchronize their activity. And this hyperconnectivity of the brainwave, is what differentiates, in the end, conscious versus not conscious experience. Now, after he identifies the 4 signatures of consciousness, which are amplification, the P3 wave, high frequency, and synchronization, Dehaene makes an interesting argument about the isomorphism, or the parallelism, between our conscious experience and the neural signatures themselves. He argues that our experience of the world, for example, is relatively stable. If I look at something like this bookshelf, my perception, my conscious experience of it is relatively stable unless there are drastic changes in my environment. If that's true, then it means that the neural events that support my conscious experience of the bookshelf must themselves also be stable. Indeed, he argues that there are 3 properties of experience that must be shared by their underlying neural signatures. And those are 1, stability, 2, invariance, and 3, reproducibility. Now, aside from stability, invariance, and reproducibility, Dehaene argues that the signatures of consciousness must also have causal power. In other words, they must cause experience rather than simply be correlated with it. This is why in the book he differentiates between what neuroscientists often call the NCCs of consciousness, the neural correlates of consciousness, and what he calls the neural signatures of consciousness. He says, I'm not interested in correlations, I want direct causation. This is why towards the end of the book, Dehaene spends quite a lot of time talking about the fact that scientists over the last century have made significant strides in identifying which manipulations in which parts of the brain can generate which subjective experiences almost in a vacuum, like a brain in a vat. And I want to read to you a short paragraph from his book from page 153, where he talks about the success that scientists have had in eliciting hallucinations in the laboratory. He writes, sparking off an electrode atop the face region of the ventral visual cortex can immediately induce the subjective perception of a face. Moving the stimulation forward into the anterior temporal lobe can awaken complex memories drawn from the patient's past experience. One patient smelled burnt toast. Another saw and heard a full orchestra playing with all its instruments. Others experienced even more complex and dramatically vivid dreamlike states. They saw themselves giving birth, living through a horror movie, or were projected back into a Proustian episode of their childhood. Wilder Penfield, the Canadian neuroscientist who pioneered these experiments, concluded that our cortical microcircuits contain a dormant record of the major and minor events of our lives, ready to be awakened by brain stimulation. Dehaene brings his analysis of the signatures of consciousness to a close by noting that if we can generate experiences in a laboratory, it means that experience is in fact causally dependent upon these neural signatures. And that in theory, this means that we should be able to manipulate the neural signatures as a way of manipulating people's experience of the world, either to make sure that something that was unconscious is brought into consciousness or vice versa. So he concludes by saying once again that a movie like The Matrix, although currently science fiction, might soon be a scientific reality.